Hello there, one and all, and welcome to the Brewing Labs. For this iteration of our show, Design Around an Archetype, I decided to actually explore more around both an archetype and around a card that I was really excited to play with the M20 core set, which in this case, as you can see on screen here, is Yarok the Desecrated, a 5-mana elemental creature, 3/5 with Death Touch and Lifelink, very nifty. But we're not doing it for that, we're doing it for the little bottom tets. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers in additional time. Whew, the amount of shenanigans you can do with this card is absurd. So, for this iteration of the labs, we're going to go talk about a little deck archetype that's actually been very popular in kind of like the past season that got a significant upgrade thanks to Yarok the Desecrated. Let's talk about the archetype that I like to call the Explorer Citadel archetype. Now, for those who don't know, the main archetype that this roams around is the card Bolas Citadel. What Bolas Citadel does is essentially it's a 6-cost artifact that you may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may play the top card of your library. If you do, or cast a spell this way, you have to pay life equal to its converted mana cost rather than pay its mana cost. And it also has a teeny nifty activated ability to sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. Each opponent loses 10 life. Now, this is more kind of like a commander piece, some people would say, but there is actually one nifty little trick you can do with it in Standard, and that is using something along the line called the Explorer package. Now, for people who don't know what the Explorer package is, Explorer was a mechanic within the Rivals of Ixalan and also Ixalan block. Basically, it's a mechanic that essentially says, as we mentioned here with Seeker Squire as an example, reveal the top card of your library, put that card into your hand. If it's a land, otherwise, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, then put the card back or put it into your graveyard. Surprisingly, the Explorer mechanic synergizes ridiculously well with Bolas Citadel, since it allows us to manipulate our deck and help keep cards on the top that we would rather play. Now, the catch-22 is, technically speaking, this is going to cost us a lot of life, and since we're at 20 life, that could be a little tricky. Now, we have cards to help us with that, like Heal Degrade to help us gain life, but the main kind of like star of the show to help with the Explorer package in general, especially if we're going with the Bolas Citadel game plan, is obviously Wiggruff Walker. 1 in a green, 1 free elemental, and whenever a creature you control explores, which we have a couple that does that, you put a +1/+1 counter on Wiggruff Walker, and you gain free life. That is very significant to help us, essentially, with this Bolas Citadel game plan of playing our deck, essentially. Because what we can do is, if we have Wiggruff Walker on the battlefield, we play cards on the top of our library, we lose life, but since a majority of them are the Explorer creatures, such as Merfolk Branchwalker and Jadelight Ranger, we gain significant amounts of life every time they explore. Now, this deck was sort of popular over the past season. The catch-22 is, even with the cards, powerful cards such as Jadelight Ranger, which explores twice, and even the Merfolk Branchwalker, it's sometimes really you get your little standstills that kind of make it where you can't play a card on the top of your library, and you don't really have enough life to play the next card. However, Yarok the Desecrated solves that problem very, very significantly. Since what happens is, since the triggers activate on twice, because as people can see with Merfolk Branchwalker and Jadelight Ranger, it's when they enter the battlefield they explore. Which means, technically then, they trigger off Yarok, which means it gives you an additional Explore trigger. With like Merfolk Branchwalker, you explore 2 times, and with stuff like Jadelight Ranger, you explore 4 times, which makes the life gain that you get from Wiggruff Walker significantly a lot to help us go through our deck a lot more consistently. Also in the deck that actually from the core set that helps this deck out quite a lot, and it even caught me by surprise because I thought it was more going to be a card for like the Naya Feather decks, Season of Growth. Season of Growth, 1 in green, enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. Whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you control, draw a card. Now, we're going to ignore that second part of that Tetsu's enchantment since we don't have any buff spells in our deck, so we're just going to scratch that out. What we're going to pay attention to is whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, scry 1. which yet again, thanks to Yarok, helps us to actually scry too. And that, as we've been mentioning before, for on repeating and repeating again, we really want to manipulate the top of our deck significantly, so with Bolas Citadel, we can play our cards out. And Season of Growth helps that out significantly. We could put either a nice land on top, or we could put also a creature on top that we would want to play that's in our life gain. And if a creature is too high cost, or we think we can't play it right off the bat, boop, we put it on the bottom. Very powerful ability in this deck. I also throw in one Mu Yanlin Skydancer. Mostly I just like this card as a nice tech card, at least if you're going best of run. The ability to be able to nerf kind of like a creature's attack and flying is pretty significant. As well as creating a blue elemental bird creature token can help us create a blocker, which then synergizes with stuff like Season of Growth, and another card we're going to get to, going back to the Explorer package, Path of Discovery. Path of Discovery is a 4-cost enchantment, we're only running 2 of, but whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, it explores. So it makes our creatures that don't have explore triggers in general be able to explore, such as Wiggruff Walker itself, the elemental token you get from the Mu Yanlin, as long as some other creatures we're going to be talking about, which then now triggers out the Wiggruff Walker, which then hopefully if Yarok's on the battlefield gives us additional synergy triggers. You're kind of seeing how it's kind of a snowball getting bigger and bigger with all the synergies here. I also put in, I know this is going to be to some people kind of blasphemy, but I put only 2 of Risen Reef. Now don't get me wrong, Risen Reef is a really, really good card. 1 green and a blue, 1/1, elemental. When Risen Reef or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it into the battlefield tap. If you don't, put that card into the battlefield, put it into your hand. This card is legitimately one of the more powerful uncommons that came from the core set, without a doubt. The fact that this gives us a Coiling Oracle, I believe is the name of the card. I always get my card names a little messed up. I apologize in advance. The fact that it gives us a Coiling Oracle effect on this free cost creature, as well as that effect triggering multiple times if we have elementals in our deck, which we have a few, like Yarok itself is an elemental, as well as Wiggruff Walker. The fact that we have those additional triggers to help dig into our deck more and get semi-card draw that doesn't get negated by Narset or get more ramp by putting lands on the battlefield, which helps us get faster to Bolas Citadel, is nothing to sneeze at. Plus, the fact that it can trigger additional times with Yarok is just absurd. I also put Jace Wielder of Mysteries in the deck, mostly because when this deck goes off, there is a statistical chance that you might accidentally mill yourself out. So I put Jace Wielder of Mysteries in there, just in case if we accidentally play our entire deck and we use this as an alternate win con. I also put Spark Double in the deck, which Spark Double, 3 and a blue, a creature illusion, which has, you may have Spark Double into the battlefield as a copy of a creature or a planeswalker you control, except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. If it's a creature, if it enters with an additional loyalty counter if it's a planeswalker. So +1 creature, +1 counter. What's significant though is this last little part that's hard when you read this whole bit of text, which is the following. And it isn't a legendary if that permanent is a legendary that you copy. Now, the reason why this is very significant is because there's a legendary rule in Magic for people who are new to Magic in general. The legendary rule basically states that you can only have one of each, kind of like a legendary creature or legendary quote-unquote planeswalker of the same card, like for on the battlefield. So, for example, we can't have 2 Jace Wielder of Mysteries on the battlefield at the same time under our control. If that happens, we have to choose one and the other one gets sacrificed. Spark Double erratas that rule. Essentially, then we can have either 2 Jaces, or more importantly, and the more reason they're in the deck, we can have an additional copy of Yarok the Desecrated. Which then, when that stacks, it allows our permanents to trigger an additional time other than the additional time with the original copy. So that can lead to some ridiculously absurd shenanigans. I mean, there's some games where you're going to gain like over 180 life. Like, seriously, it's absurd. And even worst case scenario, Spark though can just be used to copy a nifty little battle cry if we need to, such as, for example, maybe we're a little low on life, but we have Wiggruff Walker and one of our Explorer creatures out. There are just sometimes where I play this and copy one of my Explorer creatures like J-Light Ranger or Wiggruff Walker, and it's not much of a sweat. So keep that in mind. Also in the deck is Ravenous Chupacabra, just pretty much the Flame Ton Kavu of this standard. It's a good card, helps remove creatures, and also with Yarok we can remove multiple creatures, which is very nice. One of my more experimental additions to the deck is Mesmerizing Binfid, a 5 mana creature that's a 4/5, and when it enters the battlefield, aka triggers additional with Yarok, you create 2/0/2 blue illusion creature tokens with whenever this creature deck blots a creature, that creature doesn't untap during its control, and that's untap stat. Mesmerizing Binfid has hexproof as long as you control an illusion. Now, originally in the spot, I actually took this card out and actually put it in. Let's see, I always forget the name of this card. I originally put 2 copies of Frostlinks in the deck because the additional tempo you get from the card is actually pretty good. However, I like the effect of Mesmerizing Binfid a lot more in the deck. While Frostlink synergizes with some cards in our deck like Risen Reef and such, we're not really a totally Risen Reef deck, we're more of a Yarok deck. So I like the synergies from Binfid a lot more significant since getting 4 tokens on the battlefield that helps us create more of a defensive position, that helps us to save our life total, so once we go off of Bolas Citadel, we can keep constantly just, playing cards, losing life, gain life, lose life, gain life, and use this as kind of like an insurance policy. Plus, the factor that it has hexproof is a very significantly powerful ability, which then you could just essentially use this sometimes if you, let's say, have a Path of Discovery on the battlefield. There are times where you can attack with this as a 5/6 while you have your Wall of Illusions to help protect you, and there's some games where you're going to win by that way alone. Also, Yarok, as we mentioned, the highlight card of the deck. Bolas Citadel, the other highlight card of the deck. I put a 1-of Command the Dread Horde. This is more just a kind of a emergency pole switch kind of scenario. Let's say a lot of our cards get removed by board wipes and such, and presuming the opponent's not running any graveyard hate, then we use Command of the Dread Horde just essentially as a way to bring back our creatures onto the battlefield, which hopefully if we have cards like Wiggruff Walker and a couple of the Explorer creatures in our deck as well as a Yarok in the graveyard, then hopefully we get a more life gained than the life lost we're going to get from Command the Dread Horde. So that's kind of the deck in the nutshell. Let's actually go to the land base in this deck. I put 1 of each of the basic in the deck, which is Island, Swamp, Forest. I put in 2 Drowned Catacombs, 4 Watery Grave, 4 Overgrown Tomb, 2 Temple of Malady, 4 Breeding Pools, 2 Temple of Mysteries, 1 Blast Zone against the Mono Blue shenanigans, and 2 Field of the Dead. Now, one thing I would also recommend for this deck, as sacrilegious as this is going to sound, there's sometimes where I would recommend not playing a playset of the Shocklands. Like one of my original iterations of the deck, I actually went with a free of each of them and put additional land types in the deck. Like, let's say, even though you are going to lose a little bit of tempo with this, I put in cards like 1 of Evolving Wilds, or even just stuff that is a additional card that's a multiple land type, like for example, you could put in Gateway Plaza, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend stuff for, well, actually, let's just go to the land base real quick, and I'll just show you stuff you can put in. You can put in, like, either additional of the tap lands that are, for example, like, let's say here, we don't have any cemeteries, so we can put in stuff like Woodland Cemetery as a 2-of, which actually is probably the better approach here. You can also put in gates, and if you want to, go with a gate package of sorts. Because there are some little synergies you can do with the gate package that I've been thinking of with a angel variation of Yarok that I have in the back of my brain. Or even other lands that you think are beneficial to your overall deck strategy that have maybe powerful ETB effects. Heck, you could even put in stuff like Field of Ruin if you feel like you need to destroy some problematic lands like Search for Ascanta Flips or something like that. And the reason why I recommend that is because the synergy with Field of the Dead. What Field of the Dead does for our deck is pretty significant. So, it enters the battlefield tap, you only add a colorless mana, but when Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, which we try to make our land type variety to meet that condition, you create a 2/2 black zombie token. Which you're thinking, what's the benefit we're going to get from that? Well, one thing that people have been mistaken with Yarok is the factor that's sort of like Panharmonicon, but it affects all permanents, including the land triggers. And then we also have cards like Path of Discovery in our deck. So literally, we can set up a late game engine where we play our lands, and then thanks to Yarok, we create like 2 zombies, which then actually will trigger Explore twice, which then if we have a Wiggruff Walker on the battlefield, which help us gain more life. It's just a nice little suboptimal kind of like side package to help us get better with our life gain synergies to help us go off with the Bolas Citadel game plan. As for the side, honestly, the sideboard can be a little bit manipulated. I actually want to put in some more Shifting Ceratops, actually. So, Shifting Ceratops, great card. I'm even debating about main boarding this if I go best of 1 scenario in MTG Arena because of the factor that it's really good. Especially with Mono Blue seeing a lot of play. If I were to take out a card, I would probably take out... probably 1 Casualties of War and 1 Unmoored Eco, since mostly we're just digging for that card to put in 2 Shifting Ceratops. Really great deck card. As for the sideboard, it's pretty simple. 2 Duresses if we feel like we need to hate out really early game combo pieces our opponents are having in best of 3. Veil of Summer, it's just great if they're trying to hate us out a lot, so we're just going to use it as a way to protect us as well as protect our creatures. Negate, help us protect us against annoying planeswalkers. Notch's Grasp helps us against really annoying green or white permanents or creatures or planeswalkers, aka Nissa. Assassin's Trophy as just a general thing to remove any permanents that we feel like are going to be problematic to our overall game plan. Playcrafter as a way to deal with the Fetter kind of like decks because it allows us to essentially put Playcraft on the battlefield and they have to remove one of their creatures because they can't use God's Willing to protect their creature with this since it's a sacrifice trigger rather than a quote-unquote targeted effect. Unmoored Ego if we absolutely have to hate out a central combo piece to someone's deck or just a really annoying card that we know we can't counteract it with our deck design. And Shifting Ceratops, as I mentioned before, as a last-minute addition, just because it's really good against Mono Blue, kills Teferi, and it's just an overall very good versatile creature. Anyway, that is exploring Yarok land. That is the deck tech. Now, for this, I'm deciding to try to make it now where I put my deck techs into videos rather than just do gameplay videos both in the same time because I felt like the length of these videos were getting a little long. So, for the sake of this, I'm actually going to provide a link down there below when I get the gameplay video of this deck running, just so you can kind of see how the deck runs, see its overall curve, see how it works. Before I go, though, I do want to recommend a few cards for the deck, just in case, like, let's say, sometimes building Magic, you don't really exactly have every card. So, here are some cards I would recommend giving a shot at if you have Yarok and you want to do still Yarok shenanigans. Now, as we mentioned before, Yarok benefits a lot more with Enter the Battlefield trigger effects. So, honestly, all you really have to do is take a look at all your Enter the Battlefield, kind of like creatures and such, and kind of go off with that. So, we'll stick with green, black, and blue for our recommendations here. Like, some of the more cheap budget ones is like, let's say, for example, Fairy Miscreant. Oh, hey, with Yarok on the battlefield, you draw multiple cards. Not that exciting, but something to consider. Augur of Bolas could probably be used for a combo deck to dig multiple spells. Merfolk Trister is probably the better option since the flash ability is significant and the fact that you can tap down multiple creatures. It kind of looks like a Frostlinks, but for cheaper, which is nice, or more expensive if you consider 2 blue, technically 3 mana, depending on your overall deck design, especially in a free colored deck, so keep that in mind. Fibblefib to draw multiple cards, or even the more jankier shenanigans, you maybe can go Naban and put Yarok in the same deck, and then put all the wizards with powerful ETBs and just go with shenanigans. I also am tempted to do kind of like a Narset deck with Yarok and Induced Amnesia to try to make it where essentially the player will dig and draw for their deck a lot, but then they can't draw that many cards due to Narset and kind of like make a semi-mill package. You could also go with kind of like an Amass deck as well, since there's a lot of powerful Amass creatures in blue and black. Like, there's a lot of ways you can go about this, and that's kind of the thing I recommend when you get a cool new little card like that, like Yarok and such. Just kind of like, that's kind of the fun in Magic in general. It's just looking at cards that you kind of took as much of a glance at, and decide to actually throw in your deck because, let's give it a shot. Also, another great recommendation is Dungeon Geist, just the fact that it permanently frozen creatures, launches creatures on the battlefield. I could keep going. But honestly, that's what my best recommendation. Those are my cute little cards to mention. I would say, oh, and also Agent of Treachery is amazing. Like I said, I could keep going. The fact that this enters the battlefield and gain control of potentially multiple permanents if multiple Yaroks are on the battlefield is perfect. So yeah, that's my best recommendation. Look at your collection, see cards that have Enter the Battlefield effects, and go through that. Now, one thing I'm going to mention before, wow, I'm actually repeating like a broken record here, but I feel like this one is significantly important. And I'm going to use Arcane Adaptation as the sample to show this. Be very careful when you read your cards, because some people might actually read this card and be like, oh, I could use Arcane Adaptation in Yarok, and then make it where I can choose 2 creature types and do a multi-creature synergy deck. No, not exactly. The reason why is because you have to read this card very, very carefully. As Arcane Adaptation enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Not when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. I know that's a weird kind of semantic thing, but there's a lot of cards that have this as it enters the battlefield rather than when it enters the battlefield. Be very careful with that kind of like text scenario, because I remember trying to actually do this in Yarok and actually realizing, oh, I can only choose 1 creature type even though Yarok enters the battlefield. Because the thing is, the permanent's not on the battlefield as you choose the creature type, so keep that in mind with this little bit of text. With that, I believe that's all the way I can explore with Yarok the Desecrated in the Bolas Citadel Explorer Package Archetype. If you enjoyed this deck tech video, please like and subscribe. Also share the videos with people if you think they would have some fun with this deck tech and some shenanigans that they can pull off with it. I am planning to have gameplay of this deck tech soon, as well as, let's see, another deck that I've been brewing in the back of the brain as well, using one specific very, very powerful land that came with us in the core set in M20. I'll show that off next time. I hope you all have a lovely day. This is LevDev, signing out. Bye-doo.